It was a bright spring morning in downtown when Officer Richard Brooks started his patrol shift like any other day. What made him stand out wasn't his crisp uniform or the shiny badge, but the thick folder of complaints sitting on his captain's desk, all from people of color who'd had run-ins with him over the years. Some would say he wore his bias like a second badge, proud and visible. The medical center's parking lot was busy that morning. Cars moved in and out as patients hurried to their appointments, parking tickets properly displayed on their dashboards. Among them was a young black woman, her pregnancy clearly visible as she walked carefully back to her car after her checkup. She had just finished another routine prenatal visit, carrying her medical papers and ultrasound pictures close to her heart. The air was warm, and she had a soft smile on her face, the kind that comes from hearing your baby's heartbeat. She'd even picked up a small stuffed bear from the hospital gift shop, a tiny token for the nursery she was putting together at home. Her car was parked right where it should be, the parking ticket clearly visible through the windshield. But Officer Brooks wasn't interested in the parking ticket. He wasn't interested in the mother-to-be sticker on her car's bumper or the fact that she was moving carefully, one hand protectively over her belly. What caught his attention was simply the color of her skin, and in his mind, that was enough to warrant suspicion. He watched her from his patrol car for a moment, drumming his fingers on the steering wheel. The past week had been quiet, too quiet for his liking. His recent performance review hadn't gone well, with his supervisor questioning his high number of stops involving minorities. But instead of taking it as a wake-up call, it had only made him more determined to prove his instincts right. "Ma'am." His voice cut through the peaceful morning air like a knife. "Stop right there." The command was sharp, unnecessarily loud, causing several people nearby to turn their heads. The pregnant woman paused, confusion crossing her face as she looked around, probably wondering if he was talking to someone else. Other patients and medical staff began to slow their pace, some stopping completely to watch the scene unfold. A young nurse paused at the clinic's entrance, her hand hovering over her phone. The tension in the air was palpable, like the calm before a storm. The pregnant woman stood still, one hand still resting on her belly, the other clutching her medical papers. "Is something wrong, officer?" she asked, her voice steady despite the growing anxiety visible in her eyes. She'd been raised to stay calm around law enforcement, a lesson passed down through generations of her family. Officer Brooks approached with his hand resting on his belt, his stride purposeful and intimidating. "Your vehicle is illegally parked," he announced, even as the valid parking ticket was clearly visible through her car's windshield. The woman's eyes widened slightly. She knew she had followed every rule, paid for her parking, and displayed the ticket properly. The morning sun caught the silver of Brooks' badge as he moved closer, casting harsh reflections onto the surrounding cars. More people were gathering now, their morning routines temporarily forgotten as they witnessed what was clearly becoming an unjust situation. "But sir," she began, carefully reaching for her parking receipt in her purse, "I have my ticket right here. I paid for 2 hours when I arrived for my appointment, and I still have—" She glanced at her watch, maintaining her composure, 45 minutes left. Officer Brooks wasn't listening. He never did in these situations. His mind was already made up the moment he spotted her. To him, this was just another chance to exercise his authority, another opportunity to make his presence felt in a way that made him feel powerful. The growing crowd of onlookers shifted uncomfortably. A delivery driver stopped unloading his truck, phone already in hand. An elderly couple paused on their way to the pharmacy, the husband gripping his wife's hand tightly as they watched. Everyone could see what this was, not law enforcement, but harassment dressed up in a uniform. The air grew thicker with tension as Officer Brooks moved even closer, his body language aggressive despite the woman's visible pregnancy and calm demeanor. The morning had started so normally, so peacefully, but was quickly spiraling into something else entirely, something that would soon shake the entire department to its core. Little did Officer Brooks know, his next actions would trigger a chain of events that would not only change his life forever, but would force an entire police department to face its demons. And it would all unfold in the next few minutes, right there in that medical center parking lot, under the watchful eyes of dozens of witnesses with their phones at the ready. The confrontation in the medical center parking lot was about to take a turn that nobody wanted to see. As the pregnant woman held out her parking receipt with slightly trembling hands, Officer Brooks swatted it away, sending the paper fluttering to the ground along with her ultrasound pictures. "I don't need to see that," he snapped, his voice carrying across the now silent parking lot. "I've already determined you're in violation." The woman's eyes followed her scattered medical papers, watching as the morning breeze pushed them under nearby cars. Those precious ultrasound photos, the first pictures of her baby, were now collecting dirt on the asphalt. A middle-aged woman in scrubs stepped forward from the growing crowd. "I can verify she's one of our patients," she said firmly, her years of experience as a nurse evident in her steady voice. "She has every right to be parked here." The nurse's badge gleamed in the sunlight. She'd worked at this medical center for 15 years and had never seen anything like this. Officer Brooks turned sharply toward the nurse, his hand still resting on his belt. "Stay back, or you'll be next," he barked. "This is a police matter." The nurse stood her ground but pulled out her phone, joining the numerous others who were already recording the incident. The pregnant woman remained remarkably composed, though her eyes betrayed her fear. "Officer, please," she said softly, one hand protectively cradling her belly. "I'm just trying to get home from my checkup. Everything's properly paid for and documented." But Officer Brooks wasn't interested in documentation or explanations. His face had taken on a reddish tinge, and his movements became more aggressive. The crowd could see what was coming, and several people started dialing numbers on their phones, some calling 911, others calling the hospital's administration. "Turn around and put your hands behind your back," Brooks ordered, reaching for his handcuffs. The collective gasp from the onlookers was audible. Even the birds seemed to stop chirping in the trees that lined the parking lot. "Officer, I'm 7 months pregnant," the woman protested, her voice finally breaking slightly. "Please just check my parking ticket. It's right there on the ground with my ultrasound pictures." A young man in a business suit stepped forward, phone steadily recording. "This is wrong, and you know it," he called out. "We're all witnesses here." Others in the crowd murmured in agreement, their phones raised like silent witnesses to the unfolding injustice. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. The pregnant woman stood frozen, torn between her instinct to protect herself and her unborn child, and the knowledge that any sudden movement might make the situation worse. An elderly man using a walker spoke up next, his voice shaking with emotion. "I'd fought for this country," he declared, "and this isn't what I fought for. That young lady has done nothing wrong." His wife clutched his arm, tears visible in her eyes. But Officer Brooks seemed to feed off the crowd's disapproval. He moved closer to the pregnant woman, handcuffs now out and glinting in the morning sun. The parking lot had become an impromptu arena, with dozens of witnesses forming a loose circle around the scene. A young resident doctor, still in his white coat, pushed through the crowd. "This is a medical facility," he stated firmly. "Your actions are interfering with patient care." But Brooks dismissed him with a wave of his hand, focused entirely on his target. The pregnant woman's breathing had become more rapid, visible in the rise and fall of her chest. Another nurse in the crowd called out, "Her blood pressure. Think about the baby." The medical professionals in the crowd were visibly distressed, knowing the potential dangers of stress during pregnancy. Time seemed to slow down as Officer Brooks reached for the woman's arm. The crowd's protests grew louder, phones recorded from every angle, and somewhere in the distance, a siren could be heard approaching. The morning had transformed from a routine prenatal checkup into a moment that would soon be shared thousands of times across social media. The woman looked around at the sea of concerned faces, drawing strength from their support. She stood tall despite her fear, one hand still protecting her unborn child, the other raised slightly to show she wasn't resisting. The ultrasound pictures continued to scatter across the parking lot, carrying images of new life while witnessing a display of old prejudices. What nobody in the crowd knew yet was that karma was about to arrive in full force. In just a few minutes, everything would change. Officer Brooks' actions were about to catch up with him in a way he never expected, and justice was coming faster than anyone could have predicted. What happened next would be replayed thousands of times on social media. Officer Brooks, ignoring all the pleas and warnings from the crowd, grabbed the pregnant woman's arm roughly. The collective gasp from the onlookers was like a gust of wind through the parking lot. "You're under arrest for disorderly conduct and resisting an officer," Brooks announced loudly, though everyone watching knew she had done neither. His voice carried a hint of satisfaction that made several people in the crowd shake their heads in disgust. The pregnant woman didn't resist. She couldn't risk it, not with her baby. But tears started rolling down her cheeks as Brooks twisted her arms behind her back. The cold metal of the handcuffs bit into her wrists while she tried to maintain her balance, her pregnancy making it difficult to stand in the awkward position. "I can't breathe properly," she said softly, her voice trembling. "Please, the baby." The crowd's murmurs turned to shouts of protest. Several phones were live-streaming now, capturing every moment of this injustice in real time. The head nurse who had been on the phone burst through the clinic's doors. Her face was red with anger as she approached, holding her phone like a weapon. "Officer, I have the hospital's chief of security on the line. He needs to speak with you immediately." But Brooks waved her off, focused on his task with an almost mechanical determination. A young medical student stepped forward, her voice shaking but determined. Her blood pressure could be spiking dangerously right now. This stress isn't just affecting her, it's affecting an unborn child. Others in medical uniforms nodded vigorously, some already preparing medical equipment, expecting the worst. The pregnant woman swayed slightly, trying to keep her balance with her hands cuffed behind her back. "I'm feeling dizzy," she whispered, but Brooks either didn't hear or didn't care. He started walking her toward his patrol car, each step an effort for her. The crowd followed, phones recording every moment. An older black woman in the crowd was openly weeping, perhaps seeing her own experiences reflected in this moment. "Lord, have mercy," she kept saying, clutching her handbag like a lifeline. A young intern had gathered the scattered ultrasound pictures from the ground, holding them carefully like precious photographs. Because that's what they were, the first pictures of a new life, now witnessing its mother's humiliation. Then something unexpected happened. As Brooks reached for the patrol car's back door, a familiar voice boomed across the parking lot. "Officer Bergard-Rudkes, stand down immediately." The voice carried authority that couldn't be ignored. The crowd turned to see a tall figure striding quickly across the parking lot. It was the hospital's chief of security, a former police sergeant with 25 years of experience. His face was a storm cloud of fury, and right behind him was someone even more important, Brooks' direct supervisor, Lieutenant Reynolds. The lieutenant's face was ash-white with anger. She had received multiple calls about the situation, including one from the police commissioner himself, who was watching the live stream. Brooks' long history of complaints was about to catch up with him right here in this parking lot. But Brooks, perhaps sensing his imminent downfall, tried one last display of authority. He tightened his grip on the pregnant woman's arm, making her wince. "This is my arrest," he started to say, but Lieutenant Reynolds cut him off. "Remove those handcuffs immediately," the lieutenant ordered, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "Or I'll have you arrested for assault and abuse of power." The crowd fell silent, waiting to see what would happen next. Brooks' face went through a range of emotions: defiance, confusion, and finally, the dawning realization that his career was crumbling before his eyes. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for the handcuff keys. The pregnant woman was still swaying, her face pale and drawn. Two nurses had pushed through the crowd with a wheelchair, ready to take her back into the medical center for evaluation. The morning sun caught the tears on her cheeks, but there was dignity in her bearing that Brooks' actions couldn't break. As the handcuffs came off, leaving angry red marks on her wrists, karma was about to strike Officer Brooks in ways he never expected. His actions over the past few minutes would not only end his career, but would spark changes that would ripple through the entire police department. And it all happened because he chose the wrong moment, the wrong place, and the wrong person to harass. Sometimes justice comes swiftly, and for Officer Brooks, it was about to arrive like a thunderbolt. The next few minutes in that medical center parking lot played out like a scene from a movie, but this was real life with real consequences. Lieutenant Reynolds moved with the speed and authority of someone who'd seen enough. She positioned herself between Officer Brooks and the pregnant woman, her body language making it clear that this abuse of power was over. Two nurses gently helped the pregnant woman into the wheelchair, checking her pulse and speaking to her in soothing voices. "Let's get you inside and checked out," one nurse said softly, while the other glared at Brooks with eyes that could freeze fire. The hospital's chief of security, a bear of a man who'd seen his share of injustice during his years on the force, stepped closer to Brooks. "Hand over your badge and gun," he said, his voice low but carrying across the now silent parking lot. "The lieutenant will take it from here." Brooks' face had turned an interesting shade of gray. Gone was the arrogant swagger, replaced by the look of someone watching their career crash and burn in real time. His hands shook as he reached for his badge. "I was just doing my job," he tried to argue, but Lieutenant Reynolds cut him off sharply. "Your job?" she snapped, her voice carrying decades of frustration with officers like him. "Your job was to protect and serve. Instead, you harassed a pregnant woman with a valid parking permit at her doctor's appointment. That's not police work, that's abuse of power." The crowd was still recording everything, but now their phones captured something else. Justice in action. The young businessman who'd spoken up earlier nodded in satisfaction. The elderly veteran wiped tears from his eyes, seeing the right thing finally being done. Lieutenant Reynolds wasn't finished. She turned to address the crowd, her voice clear and professional. "I want to thank everyone who recorded this incident and called it in. Your quick action helped us respond before this situation got even worse." The hospital administrator had arrived by now, a tablet in her hands showing the viral spread of the videos. "This has already reached the mayor's office," she informed the lieutenant. "The police commissioner is requesting an immediate meeting." Meanwhile, inside the medical center, doctors were carefully monitoring the pregnant woman. Her blood pressure had spiked dangerously during the incident, but now it was slowly coming down. The nurses had recovered all her scattered ultrasound pictures, carefully wiping off the dirt and placing them in a new envelope. Back in the parking lot, Brooks stood defeated as two other officers, ones known for their integrity and fairness, arrived to escort him back to the station. His patrol car would be driven back by someone else. His days of patrolling these streets were over. The chief of security spoke into his radio, coordinating with hospital staff to gather statements from witnesses. People in the crowd stepped forward eagerly, wanting to make sure their accounts were heard. The elderly veteran insisted on being the first to give his statement. Lieutenant Reynolds was already on her phone, speaking rapidly to her superiors. "Yes, sir. I've placed him on immediate administrative leave. The bodycam footage confirms everything the witnesses recorded. No, sir, there's no justification for his actions. None at all." A young girl in the crowd tugged on her mother's sleeve, asking in a loud whisper that carried, "Mommy, is the baby going to be okay?" It was the question everyone was wondering. The relief was visible on all faces when a nurse came out to announce that both mother and baby were stable. The morning sun was higher now, casting shorter shadows across the parking lot. The same light that had earlier gleamed off Brooks' badge now illuminated the faces of people who'd stood up against injustice. Regular people who'd refused to stay silent, who'd pulled out their phones and called for help. One of the nurses who'd helped wheelchair the pregnant woman inside came back out. She was carrying bottles of water for people who'd stayed to give statements, a small gesture of appreciation for their solidarity. The local news vans were starting to arrive, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky like metal trees. This story would lead the evening news, not just because of what Officer Brooks did, but because of how swiftly justice had arrived. Lieutenant Reynolds finished a phone call and turned to the hospital administrator. "The commissioner wants all security footage preserved," she said, "and he's particularly interested in speaking with your staff about implementing new training programs for officers about appropriate conduct at medical facilities." The crowd was starting to thin now, but many stayed, wanting to make sure their statements were recorded, their videos shared with the proper authorities. They'd witnessed both injustice and justice today, all within a span of minutes. As the morning's events started to settle, one thing became crystal clear. Officer Brooks' actions hadn't just ended his career. They'd sparked a movement for change that would ripple through the entire department. Sometimes karma works in unexpected ways, turning moments of injustice into catalysts for positive change. Back at police headquarters, the atmosphere was electric with tension. The police commissioner sat at the head of a long table, his face stern as he watched the videos from the medical center parking lot for the third time. Each viewing seemed to make him angrier. The department's public relations team huddled in one corner, their phones buzzing non-stop with calls from reporters. Social media was exploding with the footage. The hashtag pregnant woman arrested was trending nationwide, and the mayor's office was demanding immediate action. "Get me Officer Brooks' complete file," the commissioner ordered, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Every complaint, every incident report, every performance review. Everything." His assistant hurried out, returning minutes later with a file thick enough to be a novel. Lieutenant Reynolds stood at attention, giving her report. "Sir, there were over 30 witnesses. We have multiple video angles, both from civilians and security cameras." The hospital's chief of security, a former sergeant, was on scene and can verify everything. The commissioner nodded grimly, flipping through Brooks' personnel file. His frown deepened with each page. "Look at this pattern," he said, spreading out several complaint forms. "All these incidents, all these warning signs, and nobody connected the dots." In another room, Officer Brooks sat alone, his badge and gun placed in a plastic bin. His hands wouldn't stop shaking. Through the window, he could see other officers walking past, avoiding eye contact. News traveled fast in the department, and nobody wanted to be associated with him now. The internal affairs investigators arrived, their faces serious. They'd seen the videos too. Everyone had by now. One of them, a veteran investigator with salt and pepper hair, opened his laptop and began the interview. "Let's start from the beginning," he said, his voice professional but cold. "Explain to me why you approached a visibly pregnant woman with a valid parking permit at her medical appointment." Brooks shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his excuses sounding hollow even to his own ears. Meanwhile, the commissioner had called an emergency meeting with all precinct captains. The room was packed as he stood to address them, the videos playing on a large screen behind him. "This stops today," he announced, his voice firm. "We're implementing immediate changes. Every complaint will be reviewed. Every incident will be investigated. No more sweeping things under the rug. No more looking the other way." One captain raised his hand. "Sir, what about the pregnant woman? How is she doing?" It was the question everyone wanted to ask. The commissioner's face softened slightly. "The hospital reports she's stable. Both she and the baby are being monitored closely." A collective sigh of relief went through the room. "But that's not enough. We failed her. We failed this community. And now we need to make it right." Back in the interview room, the internal affairs investigators were going through Brooks' history. Each complaint, each incident report told a story. A story of bias and abuse of power that had gone unchecked for too long. "You had 3 complaints just last month," the investigator noted, laying out the forms. "All from minority citizens. All during routine traffic stops or parking violations." Care to explain the pattern? Brooks stared at the table, his career flashing before his eyes. Each incident, each complaint he dismissed as no big deal, was now coming back to haunt him. The weight of his actions was finally sinking in. In the commissioner's office, plans for departmental reform were already being drawn up. Mandatory bias training, community oversight committees, new procedures for handling complaints. The changes would be sweeping and immediate. "We're also implementing new protocols for interactions at medical facilities," the commissioner explained to his leadership team. "No more harassment of patients, no more intimidation. We're here to protect and serve, not terrorize people seeking medical care." The day wore on, but the activity at headquarters didn't slow. Officers were being called in for interviews, records were being reviewed, and policies were being rewritten. The department's response had to be swift and decisive. Lieutenant Reynolds sat at her desk, preparing her official report. Her phone kept buzzing with messages from other officers, many thanking her for taking immediate action. Some shared their own stories of witnessing misconduct, but feeling powerless to stop it. This is how change happens, she thought, typing up her account of the morning's events. Not through grand gestures, but through people doing the right thing when it matters most. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the precinct windows, one thing was clear. The department would never be the same. Officer Brooks' 3 minutes of poor judgment had triggered a transformation that was long overdue. The commissioner made one final call that day, to the hospital. He wanted to personally apologize to the pregnant woman and assure her that changes were being made. Real changes, the kind that would ensure no other patient would ever face what she had endured. Sometimes it takes a moment of crisis to spark real change. And in this case, justice wasn't just swift, it was transformative. The internal affairs investigation moved with unprecedented speed. 1 week after the incident at the medical center, the police department's largest conference room was packed for an emergency hearing. The blinds were drawn, but camera flashes occasionally lit up the windows as reporters gathered outside. Officer Brooks sat at one end of the long table, looking much smaller without his uniform. His police union representative sat beside him, papers spread out in a messy fan. They'd spent hours preparing a defense, but the evidence was overwhelming. "Let's review the facts," the lead investigator began, her voice steady and clear. "You approached a pregnant woman with a valid parking permit. You ignored her medical documentation. You dismissed hospital staff who tried to intervene. And you proceeded to handcuff her, putting both her and her unborn child at risk." The room was silent except for the soft whir of the air conditioning. Several high-ranking officers lined the walls, their faces grim. They'd all watched the videos, dozens of them, from different angles, showing the same inexcusable behavior. "Would you like to explain your actions?" the investigator asked, but Brooks just stared at the table. His union representative shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "How do you defend the indefensible?" The investigation had uncovered more than just this one incident. They found a pattern stretching back years, complaints buried in files, warnings ignored, red flags overlooked. Each incident now laid bare on the conference table like pieces of a disturbing puzzle. "We've reviewed your entire service record," another investigator continued, lifting a thick folder. 17 complaints of racial bias in the past year alone. 23 incidents of excessive force during routine stops. This wasn't an isolated incident. This was your standard operating procedure. Outside the building, community members gathered with signs demanding justice. The elderly veteran from the parking lot was there, now a familiar face on local news. He'd become a vocal advocate for police reform, sharing his story at community meetings. Back in the conference room, the police commissioner stood up. His next words would set a new standard for the department. "Officer Brooks, your actions reflect a fundamental failure to uphold the oath you took to protect and serve. You've broken the public's trust, endangered citizens, and brought shame to this department." Brooks finally looked up, his face pale. The weight of his actions seemed to physically press him down in his chair. His years of unchecked bias and abuse of power had finally caught up with him. The commissioner wasn't finished. "But this isn't just about you. Your actions have forced us to confront serious issues within our department. We're implementing mandatory bias training, strengthening our oversight procedures, and creating new guidelines for interactions with medical facilities." Representatives from the hospital were present too. The head nurse who'd tried to intervene that day sat with the hospital's legal team. They'd brought their own recommendations for improving police conduct around medical facilities. Furthermore, the commissioner continued, "We're establishing a civilian review board with real power to investigate complaints. No more internal investigations that go nowhere. No more brushing things under the rug." The union representative tried to interject, but the evidence was too strong. The videos had gone viral, reaching millions of views. National news networks had picked up the story. There was no way to spin this, no excuse that could justify what happened. "Officer Brooks," the commissioner's voice cut through the room like a knife, "you are hereby terminated from this department, effective immediately. Your pension will be reviewed separately. We're also forwarding our findings to the district attorney's office for potential criminal charges." The words fell like hammer blows in the quiet room. Several officers nodded in approval. They'd seen enough officers like Brooks tarnish their profession's reputation. Outside, the crowd had grown larger. Community leaders spoke about healing and reform. Local business owners who'd witnessed the incident shared their stories. The pregnant woman's bravery had inspired others to come forward with their own experiences. The hearing concluded with the commissioner addressing the entire room. "Let this be a clear message. The era of unchecked power is over. We serve the public trust, and we must earn it every single day. What happened in that parking lot was a disgrace, but from this disgrace, we will build something better." As Brooks was escorted out of the building through a back entrance, he caught a glimpse of the crowd out front. Signs demanding accountability, faces united in purpose. His 3 minutes of cruelty had sparked a movement for change that would ripple through departments across the country. Sometimes karma works in mysterious ways, turning moments of injustice into catalysts for transformation. Officer Brooks had arrived at work that morning thinking it would be just another day of throwing his weight around. Instead, he triggered his own downfall and sparked a revolution in police accountability. 6 months after that fateful morning in the medical center parking lot, the changes were visible everywhere. The police department had transformed from the inside out, and the story of the pregnant woman had become a turning point in the community's history. The medical center had a new sign posted at every entrance: "This is a safe space for all patients." Below it was a direct hotline number to report any harassment or intimidation. The parking lot where everything happened now had a small garden planted by community members as a symbol of growth and healing. The pregnant woman had given birth to a healthy baby girl, surrounded by the same nurses who'd stood up for her that day. The head nurse who'd confronted Officer Brooks was now a godmother to the baby. A friendship forged in a moment of crisis had blossomed into a lasting bond. "Look how much has changed," the elderly veteran said, sitting in the hospital cafeteria with a cup of coffee. He'd become a regular visitor, volunteering with a new community oversight committee that reviewed police conduct. Sometimes good things come from bad situations. The police department had undergone a complete overhaul. The new training programs, developed with input from community leaders and medical professionals, were becoming a model for other departments across the country. Officers now received extensive training on bias awareness, medical facility protocols, and community relations. In the precinct break room, a young officer was talking to her partner. "You know what's different now?" she said, stirring her coffee. "People trust us more. When they see us coming, they don't automatically tense up. That's what real policing should be about." The hospital's chief of security, who'd helped stop Brooks that day, now conducted regular workshops for police officers. "Medical facilities are places of healing," he would tell each new group. "Our job is to make people feel safe, not threatened." Local schools had even started inviting police officers to participate in community discussions. In one classroom, students learned about civil rights and responsible citizenship. The pregnant woman's story became a teachable moment about standing up for what's right. The videos from that day were now used in police academies nationwide as examples of what not to do and how quickly justice can come when people stand together against wrongdoing. But more importantly, they were used to show how a community can turn a negative incident into positive change. Former Officer Brooks had moved away, but his legacy remained, not as he would have wanted, but as a reminder of why accountability matters. His case had led to the review of hundreds of similar complaints across the country, sparking reforms in other departments. The baby girl was growing fast, already starting to smile and grab at things. Her mother often took her for walks in the hospital garden, where staff members would stop to coo and wave. "She'll grow up in a better world," one nurse said, watching them pass by. Because people refused to stay silent when they saw something wrong. Community meetings, once sparsely attended, now packed the local community center. People from all walks of life came together to discuss policing, community relations, and progress. The atmosphere was different, less us versus them, more how do we work together. The police commissioner, true to his word, had implemented every promised reform. Regular audits of officer conduct, transparent complaint procedures, and community oversight had become standard practice. "We're not perfect," he often said at press conferences, "but we're committed to doing better every day." The pregnant woman had started a support group for others who'd faced similar situations. "It's not about anger," she would tell them, her baby sleeping peacefully in a carrier nearby. "It's about making sure no one else has to go through what I did." Local businesses around the medical center had joined in too. They displayed stickers in their windows, "Safe Space Supporter" and "Community United." The coffee shop where many hospital staff took their breaks had named a drink after the head nurse, the Defender, strong and sweet. As the seasons changed and life moved forward, the incident remained a powerful reminder of how quickly things can change, for better or worse. But more importantly, it showed how a community's response to injustice could transform a moment of darkness into a beacon of hope. 1 year to the day after the incident, the hospital hosted a community celebration. The garden was in full bloom, children played on the grass, and police officers chatted with residents over hot dogs and lemonade. The pregnant woman, now holding her growing baby, stood up to speak. "Look around," she said, her voice strong and clear. "This is what justice looks like. Not just punishment for wrongdoing, but positive change that makes life better for everyone. We did this together, and together is how we'll keep moving forward." As the sun set on the celebration, casting long shadows across the transformed parking lot, one thing was clear. Karma hadn't just struck Officer Brooks that day, it had sparked a movement that would continue to grow, one small change at a time.